Hello, and welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast. This is episode 83, Exploring the Choirs of Europe, with Rupert Gough of Royal Holloway. I am honored to present to you a new series of podcasts and videos, and I do recommend the video version of these, as are going to be fun, with Dr. Betsy Cook Weber. Dr. Weber is a co-host, in a sense, on this project because she is on sabbatical this semester, and she reached out to me to partner in documenting her travels across Europe. How exciting is that? And what is she doing? What's her mission? It's essentially to discover, and you're going to hear her talk about this, the secret sauce of many European scholastic and professional choral organizations. It is true that they do choir in a different way in Europe than most places and many of our institutions in the United States. It's a different philosophy, a different purpose. And that obviously is going to lead to different practices. In the first installment, Betsy and I speak with Rupert Gough of London's Royal Holloway School. We cover the philosophy and practice that governs this fantastic choir, from rehearsal and audition procedures to the challenge of getting British choirs to emote. Tune in for a fresh perspective and some beautiful sounds from their rehearsals. A quick announcement, the Choralosophy Convention is back. We did one in Atlanta in April of 2021. The 2022 version is going to be in June in Kansas City. Okay, so right now I am asking people to put the dates on their calendar of June 13th through 15th. Okay, June 13th through 15th in Kansas City. Make plans to be here. We had a great time in Atlanta, and I've got plans to make this next one even better. It, for a lot of people, was a revolution in choral professional development. And so make plans to travel here. And on the Patreon page, I plan to be releasing more audio from the experience we had in Atlanta. I released some already. So if you are a Patreon member, you can find some of the audio from presentations at the last Choralosophy Con from a variety of people on the private podcast feed there on Patreon, but there's going to be more. I've sat on some for just this occasion to get people excited to come to Kansas City in June of 2022. The best way to be up to date on getting signed up for the convention is to go onto Facebook and join the Choralosophers Facebook page, or if you want just the specific information about the convention, Choralosophy Con has its own Facebook page as well, just a group of hyper interested folks. That convention will be limited in size, so we're going to try to keep it under about 40 people coming at the max. So you're going to want to be on the front end of that information. Speaking of Patreon, there is a producer group over there that's really helping me keep the lights on. The producers for the show are John Warner, Ulrika Igrain Munoz Alarcon, Chandler Smith, David Kowalczyk, Kyle Peterson, Michael Herron, Ryan Main, and Steve and Kathy Kakachik. Thanks a lot for your support over there. Everybody can head over to patreon.com/choralosophy and get in the door for as little as $3 a month for all the benefits that happen over there. And don't forget, this show is listener supported. That means you are using that promo code at vocevista.com, at Graphite Publishing, Ryan Main, Sight Reading Factory, mymusicfolders.com, mychoirrobes.com. There's so many benefits to being a Choralosophy listener, and those discounts and your ability to support the show and your own program, it's a win-win by using your promo code at all of those vendors. With no further ado, here is Betsy Cook Weber and Rupert Gough. All right, everybody, I am here with Betsy Cook Weber again, who is back with me on the show, and a special friend, Rupert Gough, from all the way over in the UK. I'm really excited to learn a little bit about your world. So, Betsy, first, I would like for you, if it's okay, just to jump right in and explain to me why you have left us and gone gallivanting around Europe for the next few weeks or months or whatever it is that you're doing. What tell us about that?
Well, I'm on this wonderful thing called a sabbatical, and what I'm doing on my sabbatical is listening to choirs and trying to learn from them. And Royal Holloway, where Rupert is the director of choirs, is one of the finest examples of collegiate choral singing anywhere. So to be here is an absolute thrill. And I'm trying to figure out what the secret sauce is. What does Rupert do that I can steal and take home and make my own program better, and then hopefully share with other U.S. choirs?
And correct me if I'm wrong, but you're hitting several cities and countries over the course of that.
Oh, yeah. So. Yes, I'm listening to a lot of British choirs, Swedish choirs, Lithuanian choirs, and Latvian choirs.
That's awesome.
It is a nerd's delight.
That's awesome. So Rupert, tell us about you. And even if you can go back a little bit into little Rupert days, and what was it that got you started down the path of being a professional musician?
So I suppose I should blame my family for my young experiences, but my mother was a music teacher and a piano teacher, so I was learning the piano from the age 4 and other instruments. But one day she took me to church, and I heard this amazing organ playing, and I was kind of hooked, even when I could barely reach the pedals. So that became my real focus, and as a result I became a chorister at the Chapel Royal in London. So I got involved in some interesting royal occasions as a chorister. And so my career sort of evolved through church music and cathedrals, and I've been involved in the music of various different cathedrals, and particularly Wales Cathedral for 11 years before I came here to Royal Holloway. So I've stepped out of that cathedral tradition and now into the academic world.
So Betsy mentioned earlier and described you as a collegiate director in the UK. Now, sometimes I know that we use academic terms slightly differently over here than over there. So describe what a college choir means to you in a way that might be just a little bit different than what it would mean to a US choral musician.
Yes, of course. So Royal Holloway is a college, quite a large one, because we've got about 10,000 students now, but we're a part of the University of London. So it's in the same way as King's College is a part of the University of Cambridge. But we're sort of a university in our own right, which makes that a little bit confusing. But it means, in terms of the choir, that it's a very similar setup to what people might have experienced in Oxford or Cambridge with a chapel, and therefore a chapel choir, and that sort of collegiate community that revolves around the chapel. Although we're equally a little bit different here from those older institutions.
Okay, so yeah, go ahead, Betsy.
Let me jump in and just say that, one of the differences, as far as I can tell, is that they have a requirement to sing regularly on a daily or weekly for weekly services. And so they actually perform a whole lot more than our American college choirs. Mm-hmm. And I think that may be part of their secret sauce, is that continued kind of pressure to put it out there with relatively minimal rehearsal time.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the other distinction I wanted to drill at before we move on is are singers in the choir, Rupert, are they given a formal academic credit? Are they getting a grade like a college choir would in the US?
People in America might find it very strange to realize that the same with all other universities here, these people that sing in our choirs, none of it goes back towards their university credit at all. It's kind of extracurricular, if you like.
Okay, and I think that's important for people to understand, is that when many, especially in the US, but there are probably other countries that use different terminology too, when we hear college, we think academic, we think for a grade, going towards some type of career-bound credit. And so I think that's important, because we also, I think, erroneously sometimes attach that to our ability to become really good at something. In other words, I get an A, and that must mean I did a good job. But your standard, your rubric for success has to be completely divorced from academic grading in that sense. So how would you describe what a successful week or month in your college choir looks like, sounds like?
It's certainly busy. In normal times, it's busy. I mean, normally we would be aiming to give 50 or 60 concerts a year. At least half of those on campus, of course, but we would normally be travelling and performing quite a lot. But the result of giving a lot of performances, and particularly a weekly short concert, is that we get through quite a lot of repertoire.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. And Betsy, let's talk a little bit about that as a group too, because you mentioned that frequent performing very well could be part of the secret sauce. What is your theory, do you think, on that?
I think that consistent pressure to offer something meaningful and beautiful to the public creates a focus and a professionalism amongst these singers. And I think that that's part of their secret sauce.
Yeah.
I'm really overusing that now. But Rupert and I were discussing the fact that there's kind of this remaining 5%, over and above where his singers typically live, that he's trying to get them over into that top 5% of performance.
If I could explain what I was saying to Betsy earlier, was that I do think, and this is particularly the professional music scene in Great Britain, we have many musicians who are known around the world for getting good results very quickly. And then that's why so many film scores are recorded here and everything else. I think British musicians are used to working and basically getting from 0 to 95% very quickly, probably quicker than anybody else. But trying to push those musicians to get the last 5% is a real challenge sometimes. And my aim here, actually, and I'm going to say I've learned a little bit from observing American choirs too, is that I want to learn from other choirs that perhaps take a bit longer to get from 0 to 100%, and try and bring some of that back to our tradition, where in so many places here, yes, we are used to working really quickly and then moving on to the next thing. And there's sometimes still plenty that we could learn by just taking a slower burn with some of our music making.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I want to develop that a little bit more in a second, but I also want to circle back before I lose my train of thought on what you were talking about before, with just the frequency of performance and how important that is. I have a theory too about why that's so advantageous in the part, Rupert, you were just talking about, of getting to the 95%, right? There is that's a valuable skill. Okay, so here's my theory. Performance anxiety, in my opinion, can actually be exacerbated by the lack of performance. In other words, once you start doing it so frequently, it stops being something that scares you. And one of the biggest enemies, in my experience, to quick, fluent, literate music performance is anxiety. Like, I won't sing the next note because I'm not sure what it's supposed to be, and then I hold back, and then of course tons of mistakes come from that downstream. And so I'm gonna share with you guys and my audience a very vulnerable memory from my childhood. It's going to be a bizarre metaphor. I hope you're ready. So when I was growing up, my father was a college baseball coach, which means that I was immersed in baseball from as a small child. And I grew up being quite a good baseball player. So my junior year in high school, I had college and pro scouts following me to my games in the hopes of recruiting me. So there was a moment, though, where I was playing, I think when I was about 16 or 17, I was playing 85 games in 60 days every summer. And I was a catcher. My job was to throw the ball back to the pitcher on every single play, right? So I'm overusing my arm to the point where it's starting to deteriorate, and I injured myself, and I had to, I know this is going to be such a bizarre analogy, but you'll just stick with me. And I had to retrain myself how to throw after the injury. Okay. At that moment, I started having panic attacks like you would not believe, because I started to think about, in all that time I had off, I started to think about all that might go wrong when I started playing again. Could I hurt myself again? Maybe I won't be as good as I was before. And I actually developed anxiety that I never had before. During the time when I was just playing all the time, I didn't have time for anxiety. I didn't have time to think about what might happen. And so my theory, the metaphor here, is that in the US, we oftentimes spend a month, 2 months, depending on the level of music, preparing and preparing and preparing for that one concert on October whatever. There's a lot of time in that process to develop anxiety about what might go wrong in that one-off performance. There's a lot riding on that when you spend that much time working towards that one night, and then it could go wrong. Maybe it does. Maybe it's not our best. And the singers and the conductor, I think, internalize a lot of that anxiety. And it sounds like in your model over there just isn't time for that.
This is true, and we all know, right, that if you're going to sing at your best, you've got to be confident.
Yeah.
Otherwise, your instrument doesn't work in the same way, and that, of course, is a massive difference between instrumentalists and singers. It will affect our sound if we're tight and if we're anxious. Mm-hmm. But I suppose the difference is, for so many singers in the UK, they're singing very regularly, but in services, and conveniently in a service, you're sort of a little bit detached from the connection with your audience or your congregation, and you're in choir stalls. And what it does mean, I think, all too often, is that the emphasis is on, well, getting the notes right, but you're communicating the same texts a lot of the time. When you're performing to an audience, whether that's the same music that you might be performing in church or something completely different, the sense of communication has to be quite different. Mm-hmm. So that's why I think it's now important. Yes, that we're delivering lots of different repertoire, but we're trying to communicate it in a different way if we're on a concert platform.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And that. Because I think it was Peter Phillips that famously wrote an article about that very thing, where he was talking about British choirs are wonderful at getting the right notes, but sometimes it's hard for them to get past that to truly expressive, heartfelt performance. And I wonder if that's the downside of what you've been doing, or what your model is that it can become so perfunctory to get to the correct answer really quickly, that if in that service setting where essentially they are, this will sound crass, but they're a jukebox playing in the background for a service, and it's got this functional aspect, where if that same group of singers were to turn around and give a concert on a Sunday afternoon or a Saturday evening, that's intended to the intent of that singing is very different. And I imagine if they're so used to doing it the other way, that it would be hard to make a mental switch. Is that kind of what you see?
Yes, totally. And that's why I'm using as models for my singers, I'm wanting them to learn from groups like the King Singers or Voices 8 or groups that are focused on performing with an audience. Mm-hmm. I mean, if we can give a concert and communicate well, we should be able to sing evensong without any problems. But just because we can sing evensong well doesn't necessarily mean we can communicate well in a concert.
Absolutely. And now, do you find your singers to be receptive to that concept, or is it? Do you feel like you have to browbeat them into that?
You do have to make them get out of their comfort zone. Mm-hmm. And I think for those that are brought up, again, as choristers in this sort of cathedral tradition, they're used to the sort of the comfort of the choir stalls and not having to sort of emotionally connect, or certainly, you know, in terms of eye contact with what's going on in the same way. Mm-hmm. So the idea of getting them to sort of step up and feel like they are centre stage is a challenge. But I suppose the other side of this that I feel is important is that when we are learning our solo repertoire as a singer, we are used to singing in one way and communicating. You know, we have to communicate with our audience. But so often those same singers, when they're in a choir, feel they have to somehow sing in a different way or communicate in a different way. Mm-hmm. But if they, as a choir, if they can sing and communicate the text in the same way that they would their solo song, well, that's when you have a choir that really speaks to an audience, I think.
Yeah. What are some things that you've been trying, just to like make this a little bit more concrete? What are some of those things that you do attempt to get them out of their comfort zone?
Well, for one, I do encourage them to sing some things unconducted. And one of the elements of our sort of training program here is that all my choral scholars, of which I normally have 24, they're all allocated into a smaller group with a one-apart vocal group. So they have to work on their own, and they have to prepare short pieces, which might be sacred or close harmony pieces. And then we talk about how they perform. So a lot of that is about communicating in a kind of different way. So that's an important element in stepping out of that kind of comfort zone. The other is, I think performing more secular music helps anyway. And it was very interesting when we were preparing a CD a few years ago of English romantic madrigals. So these are madrigals from the 19th century. And we worked a little bit with some of the King singers, because they were our ensemble in residence at the time. They really helped us approach the music from the text first. And so often as musicians, we're used to, we deal with the notes, and then we talk about making the words clearer. And we hear about projecting the words. But actually, it's not about projecting the words, it's about thinking about what the words mean and communicating that, and let the notes come behind it. And that creates a very different sound in itself, I think.
Yeah. No, I've had that same experience with youth singers as well as adult singers, professional singers even, where if we can kind of almost force the text to mean something, and the way that they're, even as simple as reminding them to emphasize the right syllables, which, not singers, especially kind of opera trained singers in the US, I've experienced this, they're so drilled into them to make all notes of equal resonance all the time in that art form, that it's really hard to get them to sing the cadence of the English language, which is loud, soft syllables, very much like German. French is not that way, but there is that sense in English and German in particular, where without that sense of loud, soft cadence that almost has its own rhythm, I don't care how loud your consonants are, the audience will not understand what you're saying. I think we erroneously, when the audience can't understand the choir, we think, oh, we got to make our K's and our P's louder. That'll solve it. But when all the syllables are equal loud, it's like having that professor that speaks monotone at you. You tune out, right. So yeah. And by forcing the singers to think that way, it's amazing to watch what happens on their face, because then they're actually thinking about what they're singing.
Yes. And my other job, which is conducting a professional choir in London on Sundays at a church, I've got 8 professionals. And I keep saying to them, you're singing the same Latin text every week, the Mass, and yet they're still not really thinking about the text and how poetic language actually Latin is, and the fact that there isn't a single Latin word that ends on a stress.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, it makes a remarkable difference. Just that passing. One way I think of it is passing the responsibility of that type of interpretation away from the conductor and into the singer's brain is kind of step one to getting them to sing with an emotional connection. Because one of the things I'll say to my choirs a lot at all levels is I will stop them and I will say, it doesn't sound like you were thinking about any of the words just then. It's not an accusation. It just doesn't sound like that. Sing it again. And it's almost always different by just reminding them to think about, what does this mean? Right. Yeah, that's really, really good. And I think that I'm wondering too, Betsy, to kind of bring you back into this, that as you follow, well, actually, I should ask this first. How long have you been in this location, Betsy?
We arrived yesterday, and I have not heard the choir yet.
Okay.
We've had
a
lovely lunch together.
So
most importantly, we've had lunch. But this evening I'll hear the choir, and then tomorrow I get to hear them quite a lot.
Great. So you get to kind of follow Rupert around for a few days. Is that what's going to happen?
Yes, he will be ready for me to leave.
That's awesome. And one of the things that I'm wondering too, as you start to observe, and I'm excited we get a chance to kind of catch up as you go from your different spots over the next a few months. Is it a few months?
It's 9 weeks.
9 weeks. Okay. To see if you can to make these observations of this 95% to 100% concept. And I wonder how frequently in your European stops you're going to see this battle, because and this is kind of the next topic I want us to dive into a little bit, which is that the function, as I was mentioning before, the function of many choirs in Europe is just different than how we think of a choir to function. What is its purpose? Why is it there? In the U.S., we have less and less concept of choral singing as a profession. It does exist over here, but it's not the main reason someone would sing in choir. And that's not necessarily a good or bad thing. It's just we have a completely different concept of it. We think of in the U.S., I feel that we tend to think of choral singing as something that little kids and old people do. And that we don't have it very much of a, I'm going to teach the kids this skill so that when they're older, they could do it at a professional level. I think there are very few educators that think that way. And so Rupert or Betsy, feel free to chime in on that idea. And is that something that you see as possibly one of the disconnects in our worlds?
I want to jump in about the 95%, which I think addresses your question a little bit in a labyrinthian way. It's that last 5% that's the most exhausting. Listening to you all talk about syllabic stress and meaning of text, I mean, my singers would be surprised to hear me say I'm very sympathetic to the exhaustion factor, because it takes so much just to get to the 95%. And usually for me, that final 5%, they know what they should have been doing. It's just that it's a lot. Mm-hmm. And I do think our children are trained. I mean, they learn about that top 5% back in the hands of a really gifted, skilled, passionate elementary music teacher. Mm-hmm. And that final 5% lives with them the whole time. They understand that concept because of their training, but they are rarely asked to go there.
Yeah.
But also, if I may, I find a challenge here that if we do rehearse a piece for a long period of time, or let's say we even ask them to memorize something, which British singers absolutely hate doing in choirs. But there's a danger that you then reach a point where they're reproducing something without really thinking about it.
Yep.
So that actually the performance then starts to become dead in the other direction. So there's a fine line between performing something when it's still fresh enough to sound and feel fresh, but you hope they remember to think about everything, or having everything drummed in. and it's somehow dulled over a period of time.
It's
Yeah.
the thinking that is exhausting.
Right.
You know, it's continuing to really think. That's hard.
And the emotional vulnerability is exhausting as well.
I took my choir before our academic term started. I took them away to an abbey in Devon for a week, and we normally go away for a few days and sort of do some training before term begins. But in this instance, we made a CD at the end of that week, so they had to work really, really fast. And we had Adrian Peacock coming to produce, who produced all our Hyperion discs back in the day, and who works with all the major groups. And he's a real taskmaster. And he reminded the singers that if we're singing for several hours a day, recording, you should feel mentally exhausted and not physically exhausted. If you're singing properly, you'll come away feeling mentally exhausted. But hopefully your voice is still in good shape.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned the concept of there is a stereotype, I'm sure you're aware, of the British choir master being a taskmaster. There are several that are famously fire and brimstone, for lack of a better term, and it is a professional output. I've had one of the experiences in my life that I've really cherished is I've got a couple albums that I created for a British record label, Resonance Classics, and their engineer producer has also done a lot of recordings there in London with a lot of the everybody really. And one of the things that he reflected after helping our group record was just how different the culture is in the rehearsal. Whereas in my group of American adult professional singers who are very part-time, we come together for a project and record and then disperse. There is people can raise their hand and tell me I'm wrong. And he was like, I can't imagine that happening in, a Monteverdi choir rehearsal, for example. It's a different level, but it's also a different culture. And so those types of things also, it kind of ties into our perfunctory conversation that we're having also of like, to what level do the singers feel like they are part of the artistic process, and what degree falls on the conductor to be the conduit of all artistic wisdom, and how much of that comes from the singers, how involved are they, how free do they feel to give feedback? How would you describe that culture where you are?
Well, I think any good educator is surely teaching somebody ultimately to replace the teacher.
Yes.
You are teaching them to know how to do things for themselves, to be able to teach themselves or others. So I think that's an important part of it, that I would like my students to come away feeling equipped to teach the same to others. But I think you go back to the fire and brimstone approach. I feel very strongly, like I said earlier, singers only sing at their best if they are relaxed and comfortable to a degree. So I always want to be able to encourage and have that sort of engagement with my singers rather than them living in fear. But I think the other thing is that perhaps some of my colleagues, or certainly more traditionally in this country, have had a certain idea of the sound for the choir that they want and then impose that onto the group. And with my choir, where everyone's here for 3 years, so that the entire choir is changing on a quite regular basis, that really the choir is the sum of its parts. And I would expect the choir to sound different from year to year and to work with what I have to build that sound from within.
Yeah, that sounds like a sound philosophy. for Rupert, in your environment, how does a singer get selected? In other words, is there an audition process? And if so, what is that like? And what do singers need to be able to do before they get to you if they want to be a part of what you do?
The majority of singers who will become choral scholars here are the sort of singers who know this is what they want to do at university, and to a degree are selecting their university on the basis of the choral opportunities. So we audition before people will come, so they've already made an application to the university and different universities. Then they will come and audition with us, and as a result of that, we may offer them a choral scholarship, and they will then make us their first choice, and then we have to wait and see if they get the exam results that they need. But that selection process is mostly happening before they've come to university. So they're clearly motivated about how important singing is to them through their university time. Some of those will be former choristers from cathedrals and churches, and many of them will have sung in schools. But as Betsy and I were agreeing earlier, sometimes the best singers are actually just good instrumentalists who also sing. Mm-hmm. And the ones that just therefore have quite good all-round musical skills and are often very good readers as a result of that.
So what does the audition then actually look like? Could you walk us through that?
We asked them to sing a couple of... Actually, no, I should step back a moment. We shortlist, we ask people to make a recording first of all and send one in with their application. And then we shortlist. And then they bring a couple of contrasting pieces, but appropriate pieces, so nothing from a musical or anything like that. And then the major other thing is the sight reading. And I'll have a collection of possibilities, and I'll start them off on an easier piece, probably a little piece of Latin polyphony. And if they tick that box, then we'll move on to something more atonal and see how they get. Mm-hmm. Sight reading is an interesting thing, because there are very few people that would say, I'm a fantastic sight reader. I mean, even people who are actually good at sight reading don't believe they're good at sight reading, because they always want to be better.
Yeah.
So it's always a little bit tricky, because I always feel that everybody comes out of the audition thinking they've done badly, however well they've done.
Right. Right. I don't know if you've come across this idea. One of the reasons I'm interested in this audition concept is there is a growing movement, at least over here, in the kind of this conversation about what is a choir for, that might make the argument to what you do, as your environment is therefore not inclusive, because you screen people before they get there. And is there an opportunity for people who just want to sing as part of your world? And so how do you think of yourself in, that's not necessarily a criticism coming from me, it's just one I hear a lot. And so how would you think about that concept?
We have a tiered approach here. So we have more than one choir. Mm-hmm. So after the chapel choir, which has our choral scholars in it, there's then another choir of about 30 singers, which will be conducted by a student, and is auditioned, but a much more basic audition. So that picks up people that maybe didn't get a choral scholarship, good voices, just slightly slower readers. And then we also have a larger chorus that will prepare music for a concert each term, and that has no audition whatsoever. That's actually starting tomorrow. So we're doing the Brahms Requiem tomorrow. It's 150 years since it was first performed in London, in the so-called London version in English with two pianos. So that's what we're starting tomorrow, and anybody can turn up for that. So, I think there are opportunities for everybody. But at the end of the day, if we're talking about that sort of inclusivity, life just isn't quite that fair. As we move through life, we have to be sort of selected or not for things. And if we want to create something of real excellence, then we need a selection process to find the best people at that job.
Yeah, absolutely. And my view is that we need both. We need choirs that are pursuing virtuosity, But we also need choirs that anybody can join. We need both. It's not an either or conversation to me, and that's great. And the other thing I would respond to your system there too is that kind of goes back to what is unintentionally becoming a theme of this conversation is what is the function of the choir? If you've got a choir whose function is to sing and perform weekly, then there are certain skills that a musician must have attained prior, or that just isn't going to happen. And that doesn't make them better humans or worse humans. It just means that you've got to attain that skill. You're not going to get hired as a plumber either if you can't plumb, which I don't even know if that's a verb. But you're not going to be hired if you don't have those skills. And it kind of goes back to that mentality of what does it mean to be a professional musician? What is the value of the training for that? Because it ultimately serves a function. So I think that's awesome and very sound. Betsy, go ahead.
Also, if I may, I think it's quite important that it exemplifies the fact that to be a good musician is hard work and hard graft. And all too much these days, we're used to the X Factor and stuff on television that seems to give the impression that music and the arts is just something that is just a talent that you either have or you don't have. Mm-hmm. But of course, for all us working musicians, it's something that we've worked at our entire lives and continue to work at.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. We're 100% on the same page. Presenting music as if it is something that all people can do equally, as well intended as that is, it sends the opposite message, which is that then people can see in real time that that's not true. And so then they fall back to this talent idea, like that's just, you're born with it. And that's of course the battle we're probably fighting all over the world when we train people to be musicians. So I think that's wonderful.
And sportsmen.
Yes. Yep. Now I think in sports, they have an advantage in this concept in that they're at the end of the game, there's a loser and a winner. In music, it's a little bit harder for outsiders to judge whether or not the choir quote unquote won. And so there is a little bit of an objective onlooker happening with sports where they can see that merit manifest itself in a win or a loss, and patterns of wins and losses over time can make it really obvious. I think unless you're trained as a musician, you're not qualified really to evaluate that. And I think that creates a lot of that X factor culture that happens.
To state the obvious, how wonderful is it that his non-auditioned choir is singing a Brahms Requiem?
Right.
I mean, the quality of the experience for those singers is going to be at least as profound as for his other choirs too.
Absolutely.
And as an educator, that's just the bottom line for me.
Yep.
So.
Well, I make my choral scholars sing in that choir as well, so that they can offer something back to everybody else, and obviously give everybody else the confidence to sing this music and pick it up quicker than they might without that support.
Absolutely. So Betsy, as we wrap this up, are there any other thoughts about your project and things that you want us to touch on before we sign off? Important messages.
Important messages. We are all celebrating the same things in terms of student and singer excellence and meaning. The things you've articulated about your own choirs. Also, our challenges are much the same, and I suspect that's what I'm going to find everywhere. I'm touched by how resilient all choirs and choir masters have been throughout COVID. I mean, everybody is moving on, even if we're taking a little bit of a step back, and I think I'll find that everywhere. I can't tell you, I just felt an immediate connection with Rupert and his manager, Alex. Our hearts are in the same place.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Any final thoughts, Rupert?
No, I would agree with that totally. And in many ways, the whole COVID pandemic has brought people closer and an appreciation that music is a fragile thing, or the kind of music that we make is a very fragile thing, and with a choir that rotates every 3 years. You know, if I had 2 bad years, the whole thing could be very difficult to pick up again. Mm-hmm. So it is important for people to recognize the fragility of our treasures, our musical treasures.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are some wonderful thoughts. I appreciate you guys spending some time with me, and this afternoon for you, right?
Yes.
Okay. All
and
right.
It's early morning for you.
Yep.
Thank you for your time, Chris.
Yeah, my son's walking around outside the room getting ready for school. Okay, this was fun. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Chris.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for sticking around to the end of that episode. I hope you found that to be a fresh type of choralosophy podcast. I was so excited when Betsy asked to be a part of this show with her project. That is just I'm so honored to get to help her spread this message of what she's learning over there, because I don't want to speak for the rest of you, but I don't know that I'll ever have an opportunity to do what she's doing. What a dream. And we get to sit shotgun and watch that happen over the course of the next few months. So be tuned in here for the next stops that Betsy has along the way for us. Don't forget to like, share, leave comments, tell your friends, put a note in a bottle and drop it in the ocean for people to listen to the show. I can't do this without you. So thanks for tuning in and thanks for listening.